Could the roughly 500,000 Jews in Germany during the Hitler era have gotten out if they had wanted to? Was Hitler somehow holding them captive as soon as he rose to power? And if the Nazis would have been delighted to let the Jews of Germany leave, why didn't they? We should also ask, at what point did it in fact become impossible for Germany's Jews to leave the country? 1935, when the Nuremberg laws were passed? 1938, after the notorious events of Kristallnacht, when every synagogue in Germany and Austria was put to the torch? 1939, when World War II broke out? Clearly, Germany's Jews didn't leave. The question is whether they couldn't leave or whether they chose to stay. In Europe today, anti-Semitism is exploding, most of it linked to opposition to the modern state of Israel and its policies. Many Jews have already left, seeing the proverbial handwriting on the wall. Others have chosen to stay and ride it out. It's always a choice, coupled with the reality that predictions are difficult, especially about the future. When it comes to Germany, there was a perceptible shift in the identity of the Jewish community, slowly and over time. The template to remember is really pretty simple. They went from being Jewish Germans to German Jews to Jews in Germany. The first term puts the stress on Germans, Jewish Germans. In the same way, we speak today of Jewish Americans. The second stresses Jews. As persecution increased, German had ceased to be the main point of identity. Finally, they were reduced to being merely Jews in Germany. They were still living in Germany, but ceased to be Germans. We can actually visualize their identity on a makeshift chart, placing German on one side and Jewish on the other. Bear in mind, Jews have always been a communal people, establishing organizations and societies from antiquity down to the present. On the Jewish side of the spectrum, we have the Zionists, representing only about 10% of the community and comprised mostly of Eastern European Jews. Ironically, they had fled to the West to avoid persecution, only to find themselves in Hitler's domain. And how odd that it took real persecution, the kind those Jews had experienced in Eastern Europe and Russia, to drive them into the Zionist ranks and to look toward Palestine. But 90% of the German Jewish community preferred to stay put. The main group of Jewish Germans at the dawn of the Nazi era was more toward the middle, the CV, or Zentralverein, the Central Association of Jews. Some 60% of the Jewish community identified with the CV. Somewhat straddling the center were the Jewish veterans of World War I, belonging to the so-called RJF and comprising another 30% or so of the Jewish population. Many of those were joint members of the CV. Moving to the German side of the spectrum, there was an unaffiliated group called the VJ, the Vereinigung der Juden, or Association of Jews. These were upper-middle-class Jewish Germans whose identity was completely defined by their long-standing residence in Germany. They were the last to think of bailing out. From the Nazi perspective, maybe they needed a little encouragement. On the 1st of April, 1933, the Nazis were confident enough to declare their boycott. A few days later, a law directed at Jewish civil servants was also passed. It was duly received with traumatic shock. But Germany was still a state of law. While Jewish civil servants were to be retired, they were still to receive their pensions. And the law did not apply to those who had fought in World War I or whose fathers or sons were killed in the war. In spite of what was happening around them, the Jewish community still retained a sense of security. Not everything is falling apart, they felt. And how do you suppose the CV, the Zentralverein, the membership of which included the illustrious Rabbi Leo Beck, responded? We have a chilling document published on June 1st, 1933, entitled Between Heaven and Earth. The great majority of German Jews remains firmly rooted in the soil of its German homeland, despite everything. There may be some who have been shaken in their feeling for the German fatherland by the weight of recent events. They will overcome the shock, and if they do not overcome it, then the roots which bound them to the German Mother Earth were never sufficiently strong. But according to the ruling of the laws and regulations directed against us, only the Aryans now belong to the German people. What are we then? Before the law, we are non-Germans, without equal rights. To ourselves, we are Germans with full rights. We reject it to be a folk or national minority, perhaps like Germans in Poland or the Poles in Germany, because we cannot deceive our own innermost feelings. We wish to be subject, as Germans with equal rights, to the new government, and not to some other creation, whether it is called League of Nations or anything else. Thus, we are suspended between heaven and earth. We will have to fight with courage and strength in order to get back to earth in the eyes of state and law too. The CV was expressing what most German Jews still felt, even after Hitler was fully ensconced in power as Führer. Before the law, we are no longer Germans. But we still regard ourselves as Germans, and we will keep the old orientation. In other words, we're not going anywhere. In the end, about 10% of the Jewish community did emigrate to Palestine, the Zionists, but only 10%. Maybe the position of the CV wasn't so wise after all. But the Jews of Germany did come together to form a new and voluntary organization called the RV, the Reichsvertretung der Deutschen Jugend, the representation of German Jews, presided over by Leo Beck. Notice the shift in identity from Jewish Germans to German Jews. Jews who had all along felt more German than Jewish now felt more distinctly Jewish. Here's the proclamation establishing the RV in September 1933. At a time that is as hard and difficult as any in Jewish history, but also significant as few times have been, we have been entrusted with the leadership and representation of the German Jews by a joint decision of the State Association of the Jewish Communities, the major Jewish organizations, and the large Jewish communities of Germany. Much of our former economic security has been taken from us German Jews, or at least reduced. Within the area that remains to us, the individual must be drawn away from his isolation. Occupational connections and associations, where permissible, can increase existing strength and give support to the weak, can make experience and contacts useful for all. There will be not a few who will be refused a place of work or the exercise of their profession on German soil. We are faced by the fact, which can no longer be questioned or opposed, of a clear historic necessity to give our youth new living space. It has become a great task to discover places and roads as on the sacred soil of Palestine, for which Providence has decreed a new era, as everywhere the character, industry, and ability of the German Jews can prove themselves, robbing none of their bread, but creating a livelihood for others. At least they're thinking about Palestine. That was 1933. But as time passed, a more centralized Jewish organization became necessary after the Jewish communities in Germany were denied legal rights. After Kristallnacht, many leaders of the RV were arrested. But the Nazis needed such an organization to facilitate their dealings with Jews. So, in July 1939, the Gestapo approved its reorganization as the RVE, the Reichsvereinigung der Juden in Deutschland, the national representation of Jews in Germany. The RVE was led by many former leaders of the RV, including Rabbi Leo Beck. Controversially, some have dubbed them as slaves of the Nazis, but others argue that this does them and history a disservice, since after all, they labored courageously to help many escape Germany, and they represented those who remained with real dignity. But in the final analysis, the Jews of Germany had to give up their most important identification. That's the identity shift. From Jewish Germans to German Jews to Jews in Germany. The emigration tables of the period are striking. In 1933, 37,000 Jews left Germany. In 1934, 23,000. The number actually decreased after people somehow got used to the persecution. 1935, the number was 21,000. 1936, 25,000. 1937, 23,000. 1938, 35,369 from Germany and 62,958 from Austria, which had now been annexed by the Nazis. After Kristallnacht, in November 1938, a mass panic and mass exodus ensued to anywhere, at any price. Of the approximately 500,000 Jews in Germany and 200,000 Jews in Austria, about half had emigrated by the outbreak of the war. In the end, roughly half of the German Jews were exterminated, but half were saved. But of those who did leave, who knew which country or countries would be safe? Who knew that while Switzerland would be safe, Holland would not? The family of Anne Frank discovered that. The year 1935, which brought the notorious Nuremberg laws, represents the turning point in recognizing that emigration was the only answer. For those who remained, the restrictions progressively tightened as Jews were expelled from German schools, the option remaining was to create Jewish schools. Over time, separate spheres of life arose under the Nazis. An entire Jewish subculture was created. For example, a group of Jewish athletes was brought from Petach Tikva in Palestine to play with German Jews under the nose of the Nazis, who did not object. Many German Jews, who up to now had been quite assimilated, were suddenly attracted to Jewish culture, to Yiddish plays and so on. Surprisingly enough, the Nazis approved. This Jewish Renaissance continued until the end of 1938. In the midst of oppression, it somehow made life more bearable, more tolerable. But as a result, the Jews were less inclined to get out while they could. Ironically, the Jewish Renaissance actually caused more Jews to remain in Germany and perish as a result. After 1938, the infamous letter J was stamped on Jewish passports. By then, Jews would go anywhere, and Germany would still let them leave. But who would take them? There were a few friendly destinations. Argentina took 25,000. Shanghai took between 15 and 18,000. Other Jews, such as the prominent philosopher Walter Benjamin, despaired and committed suicide. If only free nations had opened their doors. And the rest is history.